Hello, everyone. We just have a few minutes for everyone to sign on. We will be starting at 3 o'clock today. There is some housekeeping on the screen. So just so you remember that attendees have been muted and the videos are shut off. But please use our Q&A function if you have any questions for the presenters. We will try to answer them today if we can. If not, you may receive an email response. And following the webinar, we will be sending out a follow-up email with the link to the presentation and also with the handouts. There are no CEUs for today's webinar, and you can find our previous recordings here at this link, and I will also put those into the chat. And thank you again. We will begin soon. Okay, everyone, it is 3 o'clock. We are ready to start our webinar. Just a reminder that your video will be shut off as well as microphones. So you can use our Q&A function to ask questions. And this is just a list of our upcoming webinars and also the link for the SD conference. And I have put those links in the chat. So please feel free to use those today or in the future. So today's topic is the best practices with the FMS. So I will turn it over to Marie.
Thank you. If you can stop sharing your screen, I will share mine. Heather, I want to, while I do that, thank everyone for your attendance this afternoon. And we are very, very happy to have two representatives from two of our fiscal management service providers present today to have what we're hoping will be a very casual conversation with our providers about best practices. We're going to be doing a brief overview. So we're not hoping to not get into the weeds too much on these practices. We certainly will be looking at having additional trainings later, but we want to do an overview of best practices for FMS. So formerly known as fiscal intermediary. I will apologize ahead of time. I will very likely use those interchangeably today, FI, FMS, as most of us are used to that phrasing. So again, I am Marie Eagle. I am a project coordinator with the ARC of Michigan. Tanya, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Marie. My name is Tanya Lawrence. I am the Director of Relationships for GT Independence for the state of Michigan.
I'm Elizabeth Carlson. I'm the contract manager for Stewart Wilson CPA PC.
I'm Jessie Schalk, and I'm the Chief of Office Operations at Stewart's office.
Thank you, ladies. And again, we are very appreciative of your willingness and ability to participate in today's presentation. And as Heather said, we are recording this and it will be available on our website along with a PDF of the presentation. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to them as best as we can. This is only an hour, so I'm not sure how deep, again, of a dive we'll be able to go into, but please don't hesitate to ask. And if you have a question that we don't get to, we will get to you outside of the webinar. Just make sure you let us know your contact information. So again, this presentation is based on best practices when working with your FMS. I put a link in the presentation to the current technical requirement implementation guide that lists out all of these best practices in quite a bit more detail on the department's website. So I want to go into this acknowledging that we'll get into some examples of how these best practices differ from what we see happening around the state. And I love that we have two different FMS providers here so that we can kind of take a look at how practices might differ, but they are overall the same, right? When it comes, or should be the same. What we're looking for is implementing consistency across the state when it comes to working with your FMS. So it should not necessarily vary greatly by whatever community mental health you're receiving services from, whatever area of the state you're receiving services from. So our hope for today is, again, a very high-level overview. We're hoping that you will leave today's presentation understanding what the role of the fiscal management service provider is, what the role is not, and that we'll get into, again, quite a bit more of current practices versus what we would hope to see the system change moving towards, and then the importance of the tools that are in existence and how to use them when monitoring your arrangement. Okay, I'm not going to read this slide, but for those of you who don't know, these are the definitions of self-determination and self-direction taken directly from the self-direction technical requirement implementation guide. So I'm hoping that most people that are present today have a basic understanding. If not, this slide will give you a general information about what self-determination is, and that's the philosophy, and where self-direction is, which is the methods for allowing people to self-direct their own services within the community mental health system. All right, so this, and I'll also say, this presentation was adapted from a larger presentation we were hoping to do that included development of the individual budget for the SD conference that was postponed. So we basically are starting with part 2, which is you have a budget, now where do we go from there when it comes to working with your FMS provider? So the definition of a fiscal intermediary fiscal management service is just that. A fiscal intermediary is an organization or person independent of the CMH system that assists employers to manage the dollars in their budgets. So I don't know if either Elizabeth or Tanya or Jessie, you want to add anything to this definition. It's an independent entity that contracts with the community mental health to act as an assisting body for these arrangements.
Sure. I mean, I can kind of pipe in here and just kind of give a little bit of a disclaimer that we often have the problem of employers or caregivers coming to us and asking us questions around this arena, and it really truly is the CMH system that needs to develop that and make sure that the participant knows that all of those types of things have to happen at the CMH level or at the agency level before they get to the FMS. It really does kind of help streamline communications and help better serve, the participant between the two of us together, is just to make sure that they know who to go to for what, and that it's not our role at the FMS to be able to state how many dollars are allocated or how many units are approved or anything like that. So it's just helpful to know that you teach them the role and responsibilities of each segment of this arrangement. So.
Really quick, Marie, we had about 3 people with their hands up. But I don't see anything in the chat box. So just want to make sure, is everyone like hearing us okay? Are you guys able to use the chat box? Are there any, things like that that we need to take care of?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, please put any questions that you have in the chat. Heather, I do believe you have the option, sorry, a little bit of housekeeping, to unmute folks if you want to, and so that they can ask the question if the chat is for some reason not working.
Yeah, we have more hands going up. So let me, Susan, start going to allow you to talk. Us to unmute. Susan, if you want to unmute.
The chat box is disabled.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. We will try to get that corrected. Let's see what I can do on my end. Marie, if you guys want to go ahead, I will see what I can do to get that corrected.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to start on this. This is again overall, what is the role of the fiscal management service provider in these arrangements? So this is an overall high level, again, list of what is the role of the FMS. Their role is to credential the providers. So those are the staff that are being hired within the arrangement. There is a little asterisk to this one on the implementation guide that when it comes to a professional provider, so through like a purchase of service arrangement, if we're talking OTs, PTs, provider agencies, things like that, that can be the role of the community mental health in that case, because those qualifications vary based on the service being provided. So we're talking mainly like aid level providers hired through these arrangements. It is the role of the FMS to do that credentialing. And the credentialing includes the criminal background check, the OIG check, all initial paperwork for the employees, processing of timesheets, management of payroll taxes, monitoring and reporting on the budget usage, issuing financial reports, and monitoring training requirements. And we have some more details on each of these roles later, but I'm wondering, Elizabeth, Jesse, if you guys have anything to add when it comes to these overall roles.
Yeah, sure. So this is a little bit, we would want to have the paperwork in place initiating the service with the client, but just touching on the credentialing piece since that's listed here, just emphasizing that credentialing providers need to happen before the first date of service. That's something that can cause some issues if someone has initiated the service and had someone starting to work before we've done our part in that. So just reminder that we would want to have that paperwork on file and run the necessary checks with the background check, the OIG. Also, ensuring that they have completed that employment paperwork with the proper signatures, which I think we have a few slides over where we talk about the employment agreement, but everything has to be complete, signed, and that would be something that the employer would be responsible to review to ensure that's complete before that comes to us.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the method for the employer receiving that paperwork can vary.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that first, Elizabeth, and then maybe Tanya for how it differs between you guys?
Sure. In some places, the case manager will initiate that process of starting the background checks. Others will allow the employer to work directly with us. I would say best practice as far as the way we would view it would be to have the client or the family be able to initiate that. That removes that barrier of having to go through a case manager, that they can contact us directly and get that paperwork, and we can get going on credentialing their potential staff.
And with GT, really, it is just that it's a participant intake form that's initiated by the case manager and then sent to our enrollment team here at GT Independence, and then they do all the preliminary checks that are listed here, and then get that enrollment scheduled for a face-to-face or virtual enrollment. I think it's just important to note that that intake paperwork, as complete as it can be, is important, because that definitely speeds up the process of the enrollment. So.
And so I want to point out that, again, we realize that this is not consistent practice across the state right now, that there are areas where the community mental health participant or helps the participant fill out this paperwork. And what we're focusing on is trying to move towards best practices and consistency across the state when it comes to all of these steps within starting the arrangement and then managing the arrangement.
I should clarify when I was talking about the credentialing piece. So the enrollment would be initiated with the case manager, with the client, but hiring of staff, the families can initiate hiring staff after we've gotten the enrollment paperwork. So just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, thank you. Elizabeth or Ton, do you have any specifics? I mean, this is really an overall slide that we're looking at. We're going to get more into the weeds on the process as we go along a bit, but just in general, once your employees begin working, these are the steps that we're looking at. That is the role of the fiscal intermediary, fiscal management service provider. Okay, and so I'm hoping that you guys, Tanya, maybe you can start talking through the process of all of the steps of being the payroll agent and what all of these pieces look like and what they mean.
Sure. So, as the payroll agent or the FMS, it really is our job, once we have the medically necessary authorized units approved and that budget is formed, to take that enrollment paperwork and kind of go with it, with doing all of the initial checks, the CBC, OIG, driver's license, all of that. It's our job to go through the employment paperwork with them in our enrollment process, and make sure that we have all of the correct tax forms signed and workman's comp squared away. And then from there, we take all that information in a complete file and then process the payroll, essentially. There's a lot of moving parts that before you get to that part of actually processing payroll and making sure that the employee is trained, has all of the required trainings, has cleared all the background checks and all of that. So there's a lot of legwork that goes into the arrangement before we get to payroll. And if all of those steps are not complete, it can delay processing payroll, and then we have upset participants and employees. Obviously, I would be upset too if my paycheck was delayed. So it's just important to make sure that all the steps are followed, all the forms are filled out, and timely communications, I think, is the biggest thing with us, is that we find sometimes that the communications from case managers and supports coordinators and stuff isn't always timely, and that delays on enrollment as well. So I think it's just important to make sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, and to manage that self-direction arrangement. I know it's a huge lift for case managers, especially when caseloads are so high, but just making sure that you're paying attention to those arrangements and monitoring the budget reports and monitoring the reports that are sent to you for training, overtime usage, and all of that, just to make sure that we stay in check and we don't have any issues for, asking for back authorizations and things like that. Our portal here at GT Independence gives that report in a real-time situation. So you can log into our portal and see anybody's budget status at any point in time. So there really is it's hands-on and it's real time. So it's easy to kind of monitor that. I just know that it's hard when you're as busy as you are, but truly just, making sure that we have the workman's compensation policy and claims in place too. All of this is just kind of step by step, the process of what we go through to make sure that the self-direction arrangement is complete.
Thank you. And I think that, is it fair to say that one of the biggest pieces that we see lacking sometimes in this, when either a new employer is starting their arrangement or you're adding new employees, is that full understanding of the steps of the process and in what order they need to be followed, so that we're making sure that that employer knows exactly what needs to happen prior to an employee actually being able to start working and being paid to start working. And steps that are missed along the way is what often leads to a hiccup when it comes time to be paid, or a staff start date is maybe out of line with a requirement being met, right? So that's so key.
Yes.
And I would say,
absolutely.
yes.
I think that it's important to note that that they can't start working until all of these things are completed, right? Like there's zero tolerance for somebody to submit hours that they worked prior to clearance of all of these things. So that's huge and important to make sure that we're monitoring that.
Yes, and I think that to add to Tanya's point, that what we're looking for when it comes to best practices is we have a recognition that case managers and clinicians are, have massive caseloads and are overwhelmed. And so really when we're looking at best practice, we're looking at a quality self-determination coordinator who can assist people utilizing these arrangements through these processes so that it's not all on the case manager. Elizabeth, Jesse, did you have something that you'd like to add?
I was just going to emphasize the communication piece, because there are so many steps, and just making sure that case managers, families feel free to reach out and talk to the FMS, and we can help them along, every step, and explain all the paperwork that can be very overwhelming. Even for case managers that maybe don't have a lot of, SD arrangements. It's just a lot of paperwork. So we're happy to help walk through that.
Excellent.
We do have one question from Christy. She is asking that if staff have to complete the training before they can start working, does that mean they don't get paid for the training?
No, paid training should be included in the budget, and your FMS knows how to build that and code that so that it can be paid. Usually you're coding it out as like a 0 in your your documentation, your timesheet, instead of attaching a code to it. So definitely not. No, paid training does need to be included in the budget so that the FMS can pay for it. But staff should be paid for training that is required for the job. Was that the only question, Heather?
There was also a question from Steve regarding one time he did have the FMS do the budget with the client instead of himself, and it was disastrous. And they do the initial, I'm assuming that means the FMS does the initial paperwork with a couple question marks there. And he said no. What about mileage sheets? So I'm not sure if you can talk a little bit on that, or Steve, if you can, if that question was answered for you.
It's a bit hard to hear you, Heather.
Sorry.
Okay, I'm not sure I fully heard your question.
That's okay. So Steve just had an anecdote that one time he did use the FMS to do the budget with the client instead of himself, and that was disastrous. And they do the initial paperwork, and he has a couple question marks there, and he says no. What about mileage sheets?
And I think again that we're looking towards moving towards best practice. And I guess I would say that if you have had a negative experience, we want to work on problem solving to move towards a more positive experience, right? I also often was the one who completed the budget with the individual directly. And while best practice, we would like to get to the FMS being able to create that budget. And again, they have expertise and knowledge in Department of Labor rules and requirements that most community mental health, especially case managers, don't have when it comes to developing those budgets. And so we want to work towards that best practice, whatever that looks like. And, certainly reach out individually, Steve, if you want to discuss that any further. I'm not quite sure what the mileage sheets mean. So when it comes to the documentation and the timesheets and all of the required forms for the arrangement, most community mental health have those forms established. The new implementation guide does allow for the person to choose the method of documentation as long as it meets the Medicaid requirements. And again, we know that that's not implemented. That's, again, moving towards best practice. But yes, initial paperwork should certainly always be something that we're working through with, that we're allowing the FMS. They have the knowledge and experience when it comes to all of those required forms, especially when we're talking about tax forms and employment. Like they are your buffer to work with the IRS, the government, in ways that those of us typically in the community mental health don't have that knowledge and expertise. Tanya, I see that you unmuted. Would you like to add to that thought?
I was just going to say that, really, truly, we are the experts when it comes to doing those budgets and things like that. It really does take a lot of lift off the case manager who didn't go to school to do finance work. If we have the authorized units and we have the pay rate, it's very easy to plug into our template budget and come up with a budget, and then it's always reviewed with the agency first. But it is kind of a service that we offer to kind of take off a little bit of the load of the case managers, so that they're not having to calculate numbers and do things that they that really truly aren't part of a social work job. So we're just happy to provide that service, and we've had good luck with it. So.
Yeah, and we did not include in today's presentation the budget development piece because, again, that was part one. And we will still plan on doing that during the conference, the rescheduled virtual conference. So, but there are templates that fiscal intermediaries, fiscal management service providers have that allow budget development to be very simple and straightforward. Elizabeth, Jesse, do you have something to add?
I was just going to say, I'm not sure if he was questioning if mileage could be included. That could be something part of the discussion whenever we're working with families to set up budgets, that mileage can be a part of that.
Yeah, definitely. There's not one be all end all list of what can be included in a budget. Again, I don't want to get into the budget piece too much, but there is not one complete list, but your FMS provider is set up to be very knowledgeable about what can be included and how to make sure that when we're including those items like mileage or any other benefits, that they are following the correct laws and regulations when it comes to the employment of these folks. So I am going to move on to, this is just a general employment paperwork. A lot of folks have questions about what paperwork is needed. I did not include the more like I-9s and the tax documents in today's presentation because we are doing just an overview. But if Elizabeth, Jesse, you guys want to talk about these forms a little bit and their importance in these arrangements and getting them to you guys.
Yeah, so the employment agreement is going to be between the client or the employer and the individual that is going to be providing the service. The Medicaid provider agreement, that's going to be between the provider, and then the second signature comes from the CMH. There's a job description that the employer would develop, and then training. Training will be discussed at the enrollment, what training is required. I know we're trying to streamline that and get everybody on the same page as far as like what is required. Currently, CMHs are kind of a little bit all over the place on what is required for training. Just want to make sure that the IPOS, or the individual plan of service, that's an important one that needs to take place prior to hire, so they know what the plan is. And then, of course, the background checks. We're going to credential your staff. If there are certain things that actually can come up on a background check that would exclude someone from working. And then there are some things that if they come up, the employer can review that. And if they choose to still continue with hiring that individual, they would sign a right to hire, which I believe we have that listed on a slide. And then the payroll and tax forms, that's paperwork that allows us to work in behalf of the client or the employer. So we can talk to the IRS, we can process and pay the taxes, and that kind of paperwork. Tanya, did you have other thoughts on that?
Just maybe to echo or reiterate the whole training piece of it, kind of reflecting the technical guide. It is very difficult for us as an FMS company to do things 95 different ways. And we currently are doing that because no two CMHs are requiring the same training. So I would just, advocate strongly at coming to some agreement with the technical guide and getting those training requirements more in line with how the state has developed that training, that technical guide and training requirements. So
Yeah, and I will echo that and strongly encourage folks to understand the potential Department of Labor, Fair Labor Standard Act implications for joint employment if you're not following the technical guidance when it comes to the training requirements, along with the basic Medicaid provider requirements in general. We did a presentation, I think at last year's conference, and we got into the weeds on the FLSA and what the requirements are. And again, we know that this is not being done consistently across the state, but we are hoping that we are moving towards the implementation guide and the basic Medicaid training requirements to be a qualified provider being followed across the board consistently across the state for various reasons, including the ease of working with your fiscal management service provider, monitoring, tracking, training, things like that.
I was just going to add that, the excessive trainings can really become a burden, or a barrier to the families and the potential providers. So, we want to make it accessible as possible.
Yes,
absolutely.
definitely. Thank you. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about what the employer's role in these arrangements are. We often, there's like a lot of myths out there about self-determined arrangements, and it's a free-for-all, and that there is no responsibility that folks have when they're entering into these arrangements, and that is simply untrue. And everybody has a role. The fiscal management service has a role, the employer has a role, and the community mental health has a role. And this is a partnership to ensure successful implementation of a self-directed arrangement. And so this is just a general list. And again, that implementation guide has some great information about the different roles and how they interface with each other, how you interface with your FMS and your CMH and all sorts of different topic areas. But so the first one is that there is, and this is a key one that I think a lot of folks miss or overlook when it comes to self-directed arrangements, is understanding that an employer has a responsibility to understand their rights and their responsibilities within these arrangements. And responsibilities is a fairly broad term, but we're talking about responsibilities from everything from ensuring that your staff are trained properly and are qualified and understand the rules, and that you're managing your staff, everything from that up until implementing your budget as it's been approved and managing the use of that authorization. And so I'm hoping that that Elizabeth, you guys can talk a little bit about managing the use of that authorization. And I know, Tanya, you're going to have some things to add in as well, because this is a crucial pain point, I think, when it comes to these arrangements.
Yeah, so the monthly budget report, which we do have slides that we'll get to in a little bit, but every month the client, the employer, and the CMH get a copy of the monthly budget report. And it's really important that those are reviewed and monitored, because that's how we're helping them manage their authorization to last the entire period. So if it's January 1 to September 31st, you want to be watching that you're not overusing. So in June, you've used 8 months of funds and 8 months of units, when you still have 6 months to go, in the authorization period. So that monthly budget report is really important to monitor, to ensure that you're scheduling your staff appropriately, or if your needs are changing, that you reach out to your case manager, and work with them to maybe adjust your authorization to meet changing circumstances. And so case managers should also, be looking at that report as well and reaching out to families that might be over or underutilizing.
Yeah, and I think with us here at GT Independence, it's available, like it's real-time data, right? So if you have access to our portal, all of the budgets are real-time data, so you can see at any point where their budget is, and it's very color-coded, which we'll get into as Elizabeth said. But it is important to really monitor that usage. It creates a situation whereby if they overutilize, sometimes we here at the FMS doesn't even get paid for payroll that we've already issued, and then that creates an issue for us as well. So we run into timely filing, we run into end of the year. All of those things can prohibit us from being paid for services that we've already paid out. So and that's just really not what anybody wants to have happen. So it's important to manage those authorized units in checking those the portal for the budget reports as well.
And I see a question that relates to what you just said, Tanya, asking about, are the budget reports mailed to people or only available electronically? And I know that you each have individual practices about who can request them, how they're received. So can you guys talk a little bit about that, Tanya?
Yeah, so here at GT Independence, we don't send paper reports anymore. They are available only on our portal as we move towards compliance with EVV. So you would have to have access to our portal, which is very easy to get if you don't have it already. If you have anybody participating in self-direction, you should have access to our GT portal.
Ours are mailed monthly to the families, and then case manager or the self-determination coordinator gets those as well.
And I think that that's important to note that, again, this is a partnership, right? So there was a comment that they hear people often say, we didn't realize we were over. Well, and when you're entering into these arrangements, like I said before, that there's a responsibility of the person to manage that budget. And that includes reading using the tools that have been provided, including that budget report, and being proactive. And when we were planning this presentation, the question was like, well, what would we want to see happening when it comes to overutilization of the budget? And what we want to see happening is some proactive involvement from the team, the community mental health, and the person, right? The CMH is also receiving those budget reports. So the CMH is receiving them, the person directing their services is receiving them. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you also have an option to share that budget report with, say you have like a support broker or someone who is assisting you with the arrangement. You can share that with them too. So there are plenty of people who should have eyes on these reports and who are reviewing them at least monthly when they come out. And we'll go over those reports a little bit later, some examples, but they're fairly clear when it comes to the status of your budget. There's some color coding. If you see a red, like, oh, there's a problem, right? Like, we're overspending, and we need to convene the planning process in some way, shape, or form to look at what's happening. And is this being done planfully, and we are aware that we're overspending? Like, is there a need increase? Like that conversation needs to be happening when we're monitoring these arrangements. And the FMS's job is to provide you with those tools to allow you to do that, so that if you do need to change a plan or an authorization, that can be done timely. So we're not ending up in these situations where it's the end of the budget and you're like, whoopsie, we're out of units, right? And then your FMS can't bill, and then it becomes like a whole big thing that nobody wants to get into. So, I would strongly encourage people to make sure that they're using the tools that are being provided to them.
So on that note, we did have one person say, is it normal for a budget report to be 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes more behind?
I'm going to say no. Most contracts that I'm aware of require the budget report to be sent out no later than the 10th of the month following the month of service kind of thing. But I'm going to ask Tanya and Elizabeth to speak more to that.
Yeah, so GT's reporting may only lack reflecting a current pay period. So if we made payroll today and you looked at that report today, it wouldn't reflect the payroll that we made today, but it does refresh every night. And so if we paid out today, you would see that reflective in their budget report tomorrow. So it's real time. It's definitely real time here at GT.
Yeah, ours are, they go out once a month. So it's not going to be real time. So if they're, let's see.
Yeah, so it's whatever is in the billing system at the time that we run the report. But it should never be 6 to 8 weeks behind.
And so I would just add then, if you are having those struggles, getting your reports in a timely manner, you have a contract with your FMS provider that usually stipulates when those reports are due by, and I would leverage that language to make sure that our providers are in compliance with your expectations for those reports, because they are critical, like capital C critical, in making sure that these arrangements are successful when it comes to the budget piece.
And Susan says we cannot overutilize because our CMH only funds on a monthly basis, which is paid in the areas based upon the prior month usage, not yearly.
I think there's two different things here. One is what you're seeing in your system as far as authorized units, and then what we see. So when somebody submits time that they've worked, we have to pay for that time. That is our role, right? If the person's credentialed and passed all of those checks and is able to work, time worked equals time paid. So we have to pay that out. And a lot of times what happens is the authorization runs out for us, but yet we still have to make payment for the time that's worked. And so to follow up with the comment on there, what about if a whoopsie happens? A lot of times the FMS company eats that cost if we don't have an authorization. I know there's a lot of CMHs who are not doing retro authorizations anymore. And it really truly does create a hardship for the FMS, because we can't recoup those funds that we've already paid out.
Yeah, and I would add that and again, what we're talking about is best practice. Best practice is not reimbursing your fiscal management service provider for providing the function that they're legally required to do by the Department of Labor, which is paying for legally worked hours. And if you want to talk further, there's lots of different systems and troubleshooting and problem solving that you can get into when those whoopsies do happen, and we can give you lots of different examples. And the effort with time right now, we probably won't have time to get into that, but we certainly can. We can add that to a future presentation. We can go into that more. There are lots of different options that don't include not paying your FMS provider. And I also want to just add that if what you mean by a monthly being paid on a monthly basis is that the authorization does not match the plan, we should not be seeing that. The authorization for services needs to match the dates of the plan of service. That's typically a year. It's certainly not a month. That completely limits any budget control or flexibility, which is completely against the whole point of having a self-directed arrangement. You need to have flexibility to use those funds as best meets your needs throughout the year, not on a monthly basis. So I think we're going to move forward with the rest, but again, this is just a list of employer responsibilities that are there that they need to be performing to have a successful arrangement. And I did want to ask if we could talk a little bit about the further down is like the reviewing the timesheets for accuracy, approving timesheets, submitting timesheets according to the schedule, and the impact that ensuring that the employer is doing these tasks completely and accurately has on your job as the FMS. So Elizabeth, if you guys could talk a little bit about that.
I would just emphasize we're moving towards EBB, so hopefully paper timesheets or will be over this issue. But we want to emphasize that when a timesheet's presented to the employer, it's really their responsibility to review that for completeness and for accuracy. They're looking at the dates and times and codes, and if there's space for the clinical documentation, that's included. They want to make sure that the signatures are there, ensuring that it's turned in on the scheduled, due date. It's important that it's turned in a timely manner because we do have limitations on when we can bill. So some people may hold on to timesheets, for 2 months and then turn them in. Well, then that places that timesheet in jeopardy of being able to be processed and paid because of the limitations we have on billing. Also, just a reminder that, you don't pre-sign timesheets, don't make copies of your signed timesheet and distribute them, a signature every week on the current timesheet. And then we're reviewing signatures as well. That's where we have that authorized signature card that's collected when the enrollment happens, because that's how we verify that the timesheet has been signed by the correct person. So that's why we're dealing with paper. Hopefully this is going to be over, real soon, but just a reminder for those that are still using paper timesheets.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just that just highlights again the importance of ensuring that we're supporting people when we're starting these arrangements and developing them to understand that to ensure that they understand all of the requirements when it comes to the timesheets and their responsibility as the legal employer, right? Like the FMSs cannot pay for services that have not been approved legally, but they also have to pay for services that have been approved. So it's really important that we are doing our due diligence when we start these arrangements, and we continue it ongoing to support people to provide them with the knowledge that they need to meet all of these requirements, so that on the back end we're not seeing staff not being paid because something wasn't followed, especially if somebody didn't know that it needed to be followed a specific way. And I did see a question about the authorization period being a year. Typically it's a year, right? It's with the plan, but if there is an immediate and temporary need increase, like it's totally doable, right? You just, typically, and all EMRs are a little bit different for how they support that, but if there's like a temporary increase in need, you're going to do a new planning process, you're going to do an addendum, you can put a pause on that old authorization and add in like the temporary 200 hours, making that up, right, of whatever for a very limited time period until that need goes back or the immediate need has changed, and then you start over with another one, all going through the planning process. Okay. So we're going to move on, unless any of you ladies had any more to add to this slide. I would like to get to the next. So again, a little recap, right? It's imperative that people understand the procedures, timesheet due dates, payroll procedures, the fact that only accurate timesheets can be fully processed. That does not necessarily mean that the entire timesheet is not paid. It just means that only the parts that are verified as accurate can be processed. And that means that there needs to be systems and processes in place with your FMS and your employers to ensure that any timesheet that is not able to be verified as accurate can be corrected and then paid in a timely manner. And then methods for submitting timesheets. And I'm hoping that Elizabeth, you guys can talk about your methods, and then Tanya, you as well.
We have an app called SD Works. So that's the electronic version. And we still have many people using paper timesheets. And I know we've had, meetings with the state that's going to be coming to an end. So we're trying to encourage and get everyone moved over to the app SD Works. So if you have questions on that, our emails at the end of the presentation. So hope you'd reach out and we can let people know exactly how that works. But so we have both the app and paper timesheets for now.
And here at GT Independence, we also have the GT Caregiver app that is used for clocking in and clocking out and writing your progress note for the shift. So it won't allow us to make payment to somebody who just clocked in or clocked out. They must have a note, a narrative about that shift that they worked. It is not, I was just kind of echo my response to Steve in the chat that it isn't our responsibility as the FMS to review and approve the content of a progress note. It is only our responsibility to make sure that there is something written to make sure that we pay for that time. So that's a twofold answer, I guess, to your question, but we are and we aren't responsible. We are responsible to make sure that there's documentation, not responsible for the content in that. So it's something from the social work end that needs to be reviewed, and the employees educated on proper documentation from the agency side, from the CMH side. Our pay date and payment methods here at GT, we pay. We have a varied schedule depending on the agency, because we try to get them all on a schedule that we can man with as large as we are. So sometimes it's twice a month, sometimes it's every other week, sometimes it's every week, depending on your agency and how we set that up. Our payment methods are direct deposit, or we can send a paper check, or we also do pay cards. So we can send them like a debit card and we load that debit card with their payment for that pay period. So.
I would just add that we also have a bi-monthly payment for the AAAs, and then we have a weekly payment for the community mental health. So those timesheets come in once a week. Once you're in the cycle, you're paid weekly.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but you both and most FMS providers have their payroll procedures that includes dates available, and those are provided to participants and employees.
Yes.
And can also be located on your websites.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, excellent. And I want to add to what Tanya said about the clinical documentation and the questions, and we get this a lot. And I believe it's our next slide that talks about what is not the role of the FMS, and that is certainly one that we really want to push, is that it is not your fiscal management service provider is not a clinical service provider. They don't have clinical experience, knowledge, or expertise. They have experience, knowledge, and expertise in the financial world, and that is what we expect them to be doing, not to be reviewing clinical documentation. And I would take it even further from what Tanya said to best practice, is that we're not expecting eventually the FMS to be checking that there is documentation. That's the employer's responsibility. It's the employer's responsibility to ensure that there is documentation for every date of service that they are submitting for payment. And again, best practice, we're hoping to get there. We know that we're not there right now, but asking your fiscal management service provider to review documentation for whether or not it is clinically appropriate and meets Medicaid standards is not appropriate. That is not something that we should be asking our FMS providers to do. And there it is. What is not a FMS role? So first one, clinical documentation review and or monitoring. It's not the role of an FMS. And these are based on things that we hear currently happening around the state, or things that are being asked of the FMS to complete. Training employees on Medicaid documentation requirements is not an FMS role. That is the community mental health's role to understand and know the documentation requirements and ensure that the employer and employees are trained on those requirements. Creating timesheet templates, that is not the role of the FMS. Staff recruitment and procurement. Now, I'm hoping that Tanya and or Elizabeth, you can jump in here because I know that at least one of you does have a resource on your website, but it is not the responsibility of the FMS to locate providers for people within these arrangements.
Correct. So GT Independence does have a caregiver listing within our portal, and it's accessible to anybody who has access to the portal. And what it does is it's basically a database of persons who have provided services through GT Independence in the past, or maybe even current, and have voiced that they are willing to provide services for other participants. So you can search that list by a number of miles and a radius from your zip code, and it'll give you all the persons who have held their hand up and said, yeah, I'd be willing to provide services for another participant. And then we at GT Independence, once you have that list or the zip code and the radius that you want to have searched, we can actually search that for you and provide you back viable candidates. So we would actually make those cold calls and say, are you willing to provide services to Mr. Smith in this town, and then get you back the viable list of people who have said yes, they'd be willing to, so you don't have to spend time doing that yourself.
Excellent, thank you. So again, determining medical necessity, that is the role of the community mental health within the planning team, not the FMS provider. Making any budget adjustments or increases, not the FMS, and addressing joint employment concerns. So just to clarify that these are not the role of the FMS. We want to work towards ensuring that these are not things that are being asked for the FMS to complete. And we are running low on time, so I do want to get to some of these sample tools. So one of the functions that the FMS does perform is monitoring of training requirements. And I'm hoping this is a sample from GT. I'm hoping, Tanya, that you can talk through your process of ensuring that employers and employees are aware when trainings are coming due and what that looks like.
Sure. So here at GT, we monitor the trainings for the contracts that want us to do that. We do have a few that do it in-house. But really our function in this is just to keep track of the training requirements and who has training coming up, and we notify them 60 days prior to the deadline, and then again at 30 days prior to the deadline. And this is the letter that we send out just to kind of give them that notice that they have a training coming up. And it is sent in snail mail, so they do get it. And that really truly helps with compliance and not having people be out of compliance based on their training.
We also send out letters. There's also a report that will come in many of the budget reports. So the families, when they're getting their monthly budget report, if they'll, review that training report, they can monitor when their staff is coming due, and a reminder that they are supposed to be trained in order to provide, services and be qualified. And then the employee will also get reminder letters. So.
And you also provide that information, correct me if I'm wrong, delinquent to the community mental health?
Correct.
Okay. So again, team effort to make sure we get a lot of questions on if somebody's training has expired, what do we do? When are they no longer considered a Medicaid provider, qualified Medicaid provider when it comes to trainings? And using the tools like these letters and the tracking that the FMS does for you, and being proactive about that will really help to lessen the instances that we come into. This is just the second page, I believe, Tanya, of your.
Yeah, so yeah, it'll list out the required training and when it expires, where they can get it renewed, and then, any additional notes that we want to put in there. So pretty self-explanatory. Also has our contact information there if they have any questions about it. So.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now we're going to get into some samples of the budget reporting and monitoring. And again, as we probably reiterated multiple times, this is a crucial tool in these arrangements. And so the FMS is responsible to provide a monthly report that is timely, accurate, and provided to the employer and the community mental health service provider. So as I said before, if you're struggling to get this report done and sent out in a timely manner, I would encourage you to work with your FMS provider and lean on your contract language, because that is typically in your contract as a requirement. But we have some samples, and we're first going to have Stuart's sample budget report, and I'm hoping, and this, I apologize, this is tiny. We can include a PDF larger copy when we send out the recording and the PDF for folks who want to see this larger. But Elizabeth and Jesse, if you can walk us through the budget report, how to read it. You have a couple of different ones that we have to show today. So I will turn it over to you.
So the first one that we have has dollars on it as well. So if you start at the top, it has the authorization period. And then you go down and it has the codes that you're authorized for, the total hours authorized, and then the hours used through the date at the bottom. So on this one, the hours would be used through 4/16. And then if you keep going, you have the hours used versus the expected hours used. And then that percentage is where you stand within your budget. And so red is 10% over. Yellow is you're close to 10%, but you're not quite there yet. Green is good. And then blue is under budget. So you really want to pay attention to those colors. Same thing with the dollars. It's that same scenario. Dollars authorized, dollars used, and then what's left through that time period. We do also send an aggregated report to the CMH every month, and it is color coded, and red is always at the top so that they can pick the red ones right away and know who needs contacted right away.
Are you ready for the next page?
Yeah, it should be pretty much the same. It just doesn't have the dollars.
Okay. Yep. And so do you send each of these reports to folks, or can they choose which report they would like to see?
It's based on the CMH. So every CMH has it set up differently. So if they want the dollars on the report, then that's how we do it.
Okay, so like I said, we'll make sure to include PDF copies of these reports to folks when we send out the information. I don't see any questions about the reports. And if folks have questions when they receive the report and reading it and understanding it, they're certainly welcome to reach out to you to ask those, correct? Okay. And then this also from Stuart's office is a sample weekly overtime report, another hot topic pain point issue when it comes to budgets. If you guys could talk through this a little bit, please.
We would just really encourage those that are getting these reports. So these go to identified people at the CMH, whether it's a case manager or an SD coordinator. If someone shows up on the list with a 1 hour of overtime once every 6 months, that's no big deal. But if you're getting this report every week and the same people are showing up on this report, we would really hope the case manager would reach out to the family and investigate on what's happening with their services that's causing them to have to schedule staff in excess of 40 hours a week, because the budgets just do not support continued overtime.
Yeah, and I think that it's key. I know we mentioned it earlier to point out though that you really, if you're seeing a report that's showing consistent use of overtime, you're convening that person's, and it's not planned, because you can certainly do a budget that plans for use of overtime. That you are reconvening that planning process if needed to look at what is going on in that arrangement to make sure that you are staying within that budget and we don't end up in an overage type of situation because use of overtime, and it's imperative that the person understands how the use of overtime impacts their budget, the money piece of the budget, not the authorization units, right? And this is another point that I just want to make sure that I point out. We hear often that FMS providers are instructed to not pay overtime. Well, that's illegal. Like, you can't not pay overtime if someone has worked overtime hours. So we really would like to stop hearing that that is being asked, because you're asking a contracted provider to do something that is against a Department of Labor regulation, unless someone has the very, very, very rare exemption from overtime. And if that's the case, you would know that, but throwing that in there.
I was just gonna mention, if it's an arrangement that they know that there's going to be overtime, we need to make sure at the get-go that that's planned for and included. So
Yes.
we can manage the pay rate.
Yeah,
Correct.
and there are times that you can't avoid, especially right now with our staffing shortage, like we understand that there are going to be times that you can't avoid it, but it needs to be done as planfully as possible. And when it does happen, we need to be responsive to be planning and looking at the impact that that will have on the budget moving forward to make sure that we're not running out of funds. Okay. And then Tanya, this is GT sample budget.
Yeah, so I mean, it's much like Stuart Wilson's budget report. It does give kind of an overview. It's for a reporting period of 1 month. It's a monthly statement, so it'll tell you the line that says service code T1005 respite hourly. If that's green, that means your budget's okay. If it's red, it's not okay. It's either being overutilized or underutilized. And again, it just kind of, it's a little bit small on my screen. I do apologize, but it gives the monthly usage for that month. It gives the authorization summary. So it tells you of the total authorized units, how many have been used to date. And then it also gives a total authorization summary about 3/4 of the way down the page that'll show you in green where you should be. And then if it's kind of over it, you can see that that mark is kind of over to the right a little bit. Means that they're maybe utilizing a little bit faster than what they should be. It also does give at the very bottom a summary of all of the pay that's been issued against this budget to the employees, and you can actually click on that and see who was paid and how much they were paid. It's a good tool for social workers to use to kind of get a feel for where this person is with their spending of their budget. So this is available on our portal all the time in real time.
We did, thank you, Tanya. We did have a question going back to the overtime, asking if with the staffing issues that we're having, we're assuming that we're seeing more use of overtime. And can you talk at all, either Tanya, you or Elizabeth, both of you, about what you're seeing, the response? Have you been seeing increased budgets, like budgets being increased to accommodate this? Like, what has that response been to this use of overtime?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, what we've seen is, especially with the caregiver shortages, we are seeing a lot more overtime with COVID and all of that. It's been kind of a little bit of a disaster. But I think what we've seen is the budgets being adjusted to accommodate that as much as possible to ensure that the persons are getting the service that they have deemed to be medically necessary services. So we've seen a lot of agencies going back and redoing those budgets mid-plan year to be able to ensure that those overtime costs are covered. We've seen the exact opposite too, where it's not been managed and we run into a situation where you're running out of dollars before the plan year is done. And then we have a situation where it's not always feasible to work that out between the agency and us, or timely filing issues where we don't get a chance to even file for the time, and then we end up not being paid for that time.
So it's a mix of, you see some proactive budgets being increased,
Yeah.
but we're also getting some resistance
Right.
to
Yep.
adjust that to accommodate the need. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, and I apologize, we are over time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. This is our contact information on this last slide. If you asked a question that we didn't get to, please reach out and email it to us, and we will respond. We will again be doing a more budget specific presentation at the SD conference, the rescheduled virtual SD conference. So tune in for that. And a follow-up email will be sent out to all participants within the next few days. So I want to thank Elizabeth and Jesse and Tanya for your time and expertise today, and thank everyone for participating.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Everyone have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Thank you.